Shalom everyone, hope all is well. B'ezrat Hashem, we're continuing on in Masechet Sanhedrin with Hey Amud Aleph today, 5a, and we're going to start at the bottom of Dalet Amud Bet, the Tanu Rabbanan. B'ezrat Hashem, our learning today should be as Refuah Shlema again for Yaakov ben Dinah. He should have a speedy and quick recovery. We're going to have two sections in today's learning. The first section we'll discuss is how an individual judge could adjudicate, could judge monetary cases, specifically cases of loans, and we'll see how authority would provide coverage in particular areas, specifically Eretz Yisrael versus Bavel, and we'll see about that. And the second section, towards the bottom of the page, we'll get to stories of rabbis who wanted smicha in order to adjudicate in different regions. B'ezrat Hashem, we'll get to that. But B'ezrat Hashem, let's get started at the bottom of Dalet Amud Bet, the Tanu Rabbanan. Let's just remember, we have already said, we've mentioned this many times, is that when it comes to monetary cases in general, you need a court of 3 judges to adjudicate properly. Now that's mid'oraita, right? Because we know it says Elohim, Elohim, Elohim 3 times. Okay, there's different ways of looking at this, as we've already explained. But the bottom line is, when it comes to monetary cases, you need 3 judges. And in addition to 3 judges, actually, they have to also be Elohim. They have to be judges who have smicha. However, we had a debate if there's a concept of eruv parshiyot or not. Don't want to get back into the details of that right now, but if you say that we don't have eruv parshiyot, that means that loans is removed from this category, which means that for adjudicating loans, you actually don't need three judges, nor do they have to be Elohim. They don't have to be qualified judges either. So you could have somebody that is, as we'll see, certain qualifications, even as an individual perhaps, could adjudicate cases of loans, monetary cases of loans. And that is what this Braita teaches us, as Rashi learns here. So let's see. Tanu Rabbanan. Says the Braita, Dine mamonot bishlosha. Monetary cases, lechatchila, should be adjudicated with a court of 3. Meaning, even if you hold we don't combine the parshiyot, and loan cases mid'oraita only require 1 judge, but lechatchila you should still have 3, as we explained over there, because this was actually like the 3rd explanation of our Mishnah, which was Rav Acha, Braid, Rav Ika, because then at least one of the judges will be professional, will know what he's doing, even if the other 2 don't necessarily, like they were business people, as we spoke out over there. So ideally you should have 3 to adjudicate loan cases. Turning to Hamud Aleph. However, if the person had a proven track record to the public and he was a very qualified judge, but as we'll see later, he does not necessarily have smicha, but he's a qualified judge, dan afilu yachidi. So then he could adjudicate cases of loans even as an individual. Again, this is actually like the 3rd explanation back on Gimel Amud Aleph of the beginning of the Mishnah, Rav Acha Braid Rav Ika, that we don't combine loans with other ones, and therefore you don't need 3. It doesn't have to have smicha. He just has to have qualifications, which we'll get to in a minute. So an individual could adjudicate cases of loans. That's sufficient. Amar Rav Nachman illustrated. Rav Nachman was in Bavel, and he said, Kegon ana, for example, I, dan dinei mamonot b'yechidi. I would be allowed to, and I do, adjudicate cases of loans, monetary loans, as an individual. V'chein amar Rabbi Chia, and Rabbi Chia, who was in Eretz Yisrael also, he said, Kegon ana, for example, I, dan dinei mamonot b'yechidi, I'd also be allowed to adjudicate loan cases as an individual. Now, before we continue, it's important to mention, Rav Nachman was, he had authority granted to him by the Reish Galuta. We know in Bavel, the head of the Jewish people was the Reish Galuta, head of the exilarch, who was like the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael. Reish Galuta was the head of the Jews in Bavel, the head of the diaspora, and the Nasi was the head of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Nachman was granted authority to adjudicate by the Reish Galuta, and Rabbi Chia, who was in Eretz Yisrael, was granted authority to adjudicate by the Nasi. So based on that, the Gemara wonders, when Rav Nachman and Rabbi Chia say, like us, that we adjudicate as individuals, what particular qualifications are they pointing at? Meaning, what are they saying is the particular necessary thing in order to adjudicate? So, the Gemara wonders, Kegon Anna, when they both say this, Rav Nachman and Rav Chia, what is the example that they're using as the primary example for us to learn from? Is it Kegon Anna, for example, I, Digamerna Visavirna, that I studied from my Rabbeim, meaning I absorbed their knowledge, Visavirna, and I also have the intellectual capacities to add on to that, logically to deduce things, and therefore I could be a qualified judge. But in addition, Vinakitna Rishuta, also, we have permission granted. Means Rav Nachman was granted permission by the Reish Galuta, and Rabbi Chia was granted permission by the Nasi. So, is that what they're saying? We could judge as individuals because not only do we have the intellectual capacity, the logical capacity, but we also have authority granted by the head of our area. Avalona kit reshuta, but then it would emerge that if we would not have permission granted, if we were just tremendously wise and could extrapolate and had all of the intellectual prowess, but we didn't have authority granted, so dine lo dina. So then our adjudication would not be effective as an individual. O Dilmor, perhaps says the Gemara, afal gav delona kit reshuta, even if we were not granted authority, dine dina, all they were saying was, based on our intellectual capacities, our capacity to extrapolate, etc., that allows us to dan dine mamonot, that we could expound as individuals or judge as individuals monetary cases, and you don't necessarily need authority. So the Gemara says, which one is it? Tashmas, let's bring a proof to determine, is it possible to adjudicate as an individual only when you have authority granted by the head of state, meaning by the Nasi or by the Reish Galuta, or do you not need that necessarily and you just need the intellectual prowess? So Tashma, the Gemara says, let's bring a proof. The Marzutra breder of Nachman, because we know that Marzutra, the son of Rav Nachman, Dandina, so he adjudicated a case of loans by himself, Vita'a, and indeed he made a mistake, meaning he made some sort of a mistake in the process. Okay, so Ata l'kamed Rav Yosef, he came in front of Rav Yosef, and he asked him, am I responsible to make good on the mistake that I made? Meaning, I adjudicated a scenario as an individual alone. I made a mistake. Do I have to pay back for the mistake that I made? So Amrle Rav Yosef said back to this Marzutra, Im kibluch alayhu, if the people that had come in front of you, when you were doing the arbitration regarding this case, if they accepted that regardless of the outcome, they won't hold you liable, so lo tishalem, then you're not responsible to pay. Ve'ilo, but if not, if they said, we want you to judge us like din Torah, like the rules of the Torah, but if there's a mistake made, you'll be responsible, so then zil shlim, you will have to go back and pay. So the Gemara says, Shma mina, what do we see? This Marzutra breder of Nachman was not granted authority by the head of the locale. He was not granted authority by the Nasi. He was not granted authority by the Reish Galuta. So Shma mina, what do we see? It's only if they had accepted upon themselves, the people involved in this case, that they would not hold him responsible should he make an error, that they can't go back and claim money from him. But if they wouldn't have accepted and he would have just judged like a normative scenario as an individual, he would be responsible. So says the Gemara, Shma mina, we hear from this, Kilo nakit reshuta, that if you don't ask authority, you're not granted authority from the Nasi or the Reish Galuta, dine dina, that nonetheless the court case that you adjudicate is going to still be binding. Shma mina, that's a good proof. Now how do we see that? Because if it wouldn't be binding, so then the psak that Rav Yosef would have said was, not that you have to pay them back, but the entire case is undone. Meaning what you see from this is that if they accepted the outcome, they said, whatever you say, so then the outcome is upheld. If they didn't accept the outcome, means they said, we want you to judge like din Torah. So then he would have to pay them back. But it doesn't undo the entirety of the case, which means the case was effective. His judgment was rendered and it's effective. Okay, because he wasn't granted coverage based on the Reish Galuta or based on, as we'll see later, the Nasi, he'll be responsible to pay back. But the reality is, even if they don't accept the outcome necessarily, the litigants in the case, it would still be considered an effective case, even if he wasn't granted authority by the head of the locale. Because if it wouldn't be considered a proper rendering of judgment, so what would be the halacha? The halacha should be is that the entire court case is overturned. Must be the fact that we're saying he'd have to pay them back, that implies the court case is still effective. He just now has to make good on it. So you see from this, says the Gemara, from this story of Reb Marzutra, Breder of Nachman, that even if you're not granted authority, as long as you have the intellectual prowess, you have the intellectual and logical capabilities to judge as an individual, you could still judge. Now, you might be responsible to pay if you make a mistake, because you're not granted coverage like the Nasi and the Reish Galuta will give you. But the court, the case would still be adjudicated and effective. So beautiful. So what we've shown so far is, even if a person does not necessarily seek authority from the Reish Galuta or the Nasi, he could judge as an individual. Okay, but if he does, and he makes a mistake, he'll have to pay back because he's not granted immunity that would come along with being authorized by the Reish Galuta or the Nasi. Okay. Now, the reality here, let me just explain this outside for a minute. What's the pshat exactly in that? Why is it that the Nasi or the Reish Galuta grant immunity for a judge if he's going to adjudicate and make a mistake? So this is really based on a principle, which is Hefker Beit Din Hefker. I want to explain this for a minute because it's going to be very applicable moving forward. Hefker Beit Din Hefker means that the Torah empowers the rabbis to make ownerless or to remove money from one and give it to another if they see the need or that there's a special takana that's necessary to employ. That's what it means. Essentially, they have control over Jewish money. So what that would mean in the context here is as follows. The head of state, i.e. the Reish Galuta or the Nasi, has this koach of Hefker Beit Din Hefker, which means he could say where money should go or where it shouldn't go. Therefore, if he adjudicates cases or empowers others to adjudicate cases, there's a concept of Hefker Beit Din Hefker, which means that if the person who he had authorized to adjudicate, even as an individual for that matter, makes a mistake, they won't be responsible. Now, if they're not empowered by the Reish Galuta, or they're not empowered by the Nasi, as we're coming out, they have the intellectual capacities, they could judge as an individual, but they're not granted immunity. So therefore, if they make a mistake, they will have to pay back. So the Gemara therefore tells us, and I want to speak a little more about that in a moment. Amar Rav, so Rav says, Hai man debai lemedan dina. If somebody wants to judge these loan cases as an individual, but he also wants that if he'll make a mistake, mibai lemiftara, he wants to be exempt from having to pay back. Lishkol reshuta mibei reish galuta. He should ask authority from the reish galuta. Means even though you don't need to adjudicate these monetary cases, as we said, you could do it as long as you have the intellectual prowess. He should, and then he'll be covered. Similarly, Shmuel said, Lishkol reshuta mibei reish galuta. He should just ask permission and have authority of the Reish Galuta, the head of the exilarch, and then what will come out is he'll be granted immunity based on Hefker Beit Din Hefker. Now, I want to just explain this outside for a minute before we continue and make distinctions between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, because this is really a fascinating thing. Where does this concept of Hefker Beit Din Hefker come from? It's a very interesting thing. For the Persians amongst us, this might be a bit of a history lesson that perhaps you know or don't know. Actually, when I was learning with Jacob, he told me a bit of this idea, but really it's based on Psukim in Ezra as well as the fourth parak of Masechet Kiddushin. We know that the first exile of, the first destruction of the temple and then the subsequent exile was done by the Babylonians. Bavel, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple, exiled the Jews to Bavel. But then the Jews were in this area called Babylonia. Afterwards, a new empire called Paras Madai, which was a merger between two empires really, a Persian Mede Empire, which was a union, destroyed and overthrew Bavel and absorbed the Jews into exile by them. After the story of Purim, which we're coming up to, B'ezrat Hashem soon, where the Jews were saved from Haman's plot, etc. So after that, subsequent to that, there was a king in Persia called Darius, Hasheni, the second one, who authorized the Jews to return to Eretz Yisrael. And there was a great leader whose name was Ezra Sofer, who led the return to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the second temple and to repopulate Eretz Yisrael after the destruction of the first temple and exile. Now, this is a fascinating tidbit. Ezra wanted to take the Jews back, and many Jews actually decided they wanted to remain in Babylonia, or remain in Galut under this Persian dynasty. They wanted to remain in exile. So this part I'm not sure about, but Jacob, I believe, told me this, which was that the Iranian Jews of subsequent years actually emerged from those Jews who had decided to remain in Galut and not return to Eretz Yisrael. And this was actually held as a negative mark against them. It means they should have returned to Eretz Yisrael. They decided not to, they stayed there. Many of the Iranian communities or the Persian communities that descended came from them. They weren't actually from Jews who had been kicked out after the second temple was destroyed, but were there all the way back from the first temple being destroyed, which is a very long time actually. So the Jews returned to Eretz Yisrael guided by Ezra, and they arrive in Eretz Yisrael, and Ezra realizes that they have a serious issue on their hands. Many Jews, it's not a new concept actually, just like not wanting to return to Eretz Yisrael. It's not a new concept. We're very comfortable in Galut. But also many Jews had married non-Jewish wives, fortunately. So he wanted the Jews to gather so that he could give them big musar and inspiration to separate from those non-Jewish wives. And he made a decree that in 3 days from now, we're all going to gather in Yerushalayim. This is all in Psukim and Ezra. And he wanted to speak about this issue, and any Jew that wouldn't, his property would be removed from him. His property would be removed from him, would be confiscated. So the Gemara deduces in Masechet Yevamot, Petet Amud Bet, 89b, from this, you see that the rabbis are granted the authority over Jewish money, over Jewish property. Because Ezra had the capacity to say, if you don't listen to what I'm saying, I'm going to confiscate your property. But the bottom line is, we see from this idea that Hefker Beit Din Hefker. We see this concept that Beit Din has the capacity to control Jewish money. So now, applying it back here, that means that if somebody is granted authority to adjudicate, again, in Bavel, by the authority of the Reish Galuta, the head of the exilarch, so he'd have immunity, which means that he's also granted, if he makes a mistake, he wouldn't be responsible to pay back. And similarly by the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael. The question the Gemara is going to wonder is as follows. Does that immunity cross borders? Meaning if somebody's granted coverage, authorization in Eretz Yisrael, does that authorization transfer over to Bavel? As well as vice versa, that he'd be covered if he'd make a mistake in judgment. So let's see. The Gemara says, Pshita, it's obvious, me'acha lehacha. If somebody's granted authority in terms of adjudicating by the Reish Galuta in Bavel, so it's pashut that he would be covered here. He's authorized here, and therefore he can judge here. And he's covered. Or me'atam la'atam. And it's also pshita, it's obvious that if he adjudicates, he's granted authority by the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael, and he judges here, he's covered. And it's also obvious, and this is very interesting. If he's granted authority in Bavel by the Reish Galuta, it would also give him coverage in Eretz Yisrael to adjudicate. Now, this is a very interesting idea. The authority to adjudicate granted by the Reish Galuta in Bavel seems to have been, at least in this regard, we'll see Tosafot in a minute why, more powerful than the necessary authorization in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, if he's granted authority to adjudicate in Bavel, it covers lines and it would cover him in Eretz Yisrael as well. Mahani, that would all help. Why? Dehacha shevet, because Bavel is called shevet, the scepter, and we'll explain in a moment. Vatam, and there, Eretz Yisrael, mechokek, is called mechokek. Mechokek is the lawgiver or the legislator. What does that mean? Kedetanya, like the Braita explains. This is a pasuk when it talks about the brachot for Yehuda that Yaakov gave Yehuda at the end of his life. The pasuk says, "Lo yasor," in Parashat Vayechi, "Lo yasor shevet mi Yehuda." Beginning of the pasuk says, the shevet, the scepter, meaning like a king holds a scepter, a stick. The stick shall never leave Yehuda. Elu Rashi Galuyot shebeBavel. This refers to the heads of the exile of the diaspora in Bavel. Sherodin et Yisrael bashevet. They rule the Jewish people with a scepter. Rashi explains, this refers to a position of authority that those Reish Galuta in Bavel also descended from Yehuda, from Malchut Beit David, from the line of kings as descending from Yehuda. So the first part of the verse refers to the scepter not leaving Yehuda. Yaakov Avinu was saying, even when the Jews are in Bavel, the head of the exilarch, the head of the exile, will still be from Yehuda. U'mechokek mi bein raglav, and the lawgiver from between his legs, meaning that, again, the one who promotes law, teaches the Torah or the law, will also descend from Yehuda. Elu b'nei banav shel Hillel. These are the descendants of Hillel. Shemelamdin Torah b'rabim, that they will teach Torah in public. Now, what does that mean? It means in Eretz Yisrael, the Nesi'im will also descend from Shevet Yehuda. So Rashi explains, and I'll tell you Tosafot in a minute, that the heads of the Jews, both in Bavel, which is Reish Galuta, as well as the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael, the bracha is saying that they will both descend from Shevet Yehuda. However, the lashon of Shevet is a stronger language than that of Mechokek, and therefore, as Rashi explains, from this we would deduce that this idea of a transference of authority would logically be that if you get authority in Bavel, it would also cover you as a lawgiver, as a judge in Eretz Yisrael as well. That's how Rashi explains this. Rashi does add also one more thing here. He says that the Reish Galuta was authorized to judge and to promote judgment in Bavel by the kings of Persia. But his authorization, meaning his power, came from the Torah. It's just he was granted that ability from the kings of Persia. But now, Tosafot says something very interesting over here. Tosafot says, as our Gemara implies, is that the authority granted in Bavel is a greater koach, or a greater authority, than that of Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara understands that simply. So he says, however, Rabbeinu Tam makes a distinction. He says, when it comes to Isur V'Heter, when it comes to prohibitory law, actually, the people of Eretz Yisrael were wiser, because Avira the Eretz Yisrael machkim, the air of Eretz Yisrael makes a person wise. So in regards to that, actually, the people of Eretz Yisrael were more superior. But in regards to monetary law, as we're saying now, Bavel had more authority. So he says, quoting a Yerushalmi, what's the distinction? And he says the Yerushalmi teaches us because the heads of the Jews in Bavel descended from the males of the Davidic dynasty, and the heads of the Nesi'im, which are the Nesi'im in Eretz Yisrael, descended from the females of the Davidic dynasty. Quoting Yerushalmi. But the bottom line is that it's also obvious, says the Gemara, that if a person was granted authority to adjudicate in Bavel, it would cross over, granting him immunity and coverage in Eretz Yisrael as well. But this leads us now to a question. Me'atam lahacha mai. But asks the Gemara, what if he was granted authority to adjudicate in Eretz Yisrael? Would that also grant him immunity to adjudicate these monetary cases in Bavel? So Tashma, the Gemara says, will bring a proof from a story, which we're going to elaborate more on at the bottom of the Amud. To Rabba Bar Chana Dandina, Rabba Bar Chana, who was from Eretz Yisrael, adjudicated a case in Bavel. V'ta'an, he made a mistake. So Atala Kamed Rabbi Chia, he came in front of Rabbi Chia. Amar Lei, so Rabba Bar Chana said to Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Chia said to Rabba Bar Chana, he said like this. He wanted to know if he would be responsible. This Rabba Bar Chana wanted to know if he would be responsible to pay back for the mistake that he had made in adjudicating. So Rabbi Chia said to him, Ikiblu chalai, very similar to the prior story. If the litigants had accepted on themselves, regardless of the outcome, they'll accept it. Lo teshalim, you won't be responsible to pay. Ve'ilo, but if not, zil shlim. You do have to pay. So what do you see? Rabba Bar Chana was granted authority, as we'll see, he got smicha from Eretz Yisrael. Rabba Bar Chana reshut havanakit, he got authority, he had smicha from the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael. We'll see from the story at the bottom of the Amud. And despite that, since he was adjudicating in Bavel, and they had not accepted, the litigants hadn't accepted coverage overall, he would be responsible to pay back for a mistake that he had made. So Shma Mina, we see from this, Me'atam la'acha lo mahani. that the coverage or the authority that was granted in Eretz Yisrael does not cover immunity in Bavel. So Shema Mina, that's a proof that it does not cover you if you got authority. Smicha in Eretz Yisrael doesn't cover you for Bavel as well. Asks the Gemara, is that true? Mahani, does it not grant coverage? Rabba bar Rav Huna, but another person, Rabba bar Rav Huna. Now this is another person. He had received smicha in Eretz Yisrael. And then he came to Bavel, and whenever he would fight with the Reish Galuta, the head of the Babylonian Jewry, Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna would say, Lav minaychu nakitna reshuta. I don't need authority from you. Nakitna reshuta me Abba Mari. I have authority from Abba Mari, means Avi Mori, from my father, my teacher. The Abba Mari me Rav, and my father, my teacher, means Rav Huna, his father was Rav. He had a smichut from Rav. Rav me Rabbi Chia, and Rav had authority from Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia me Rabbi, and Rabbi Chia had smicha. He had this chain of authorization from Rabbi. So what do you see? Rabba bar Rav Huna seems to be saying, since I have smicha from Eretz Yisrael, therefore I don't need to listen to what you're saying. So it seems to be that the smicha of Eretz Yisrael is effective in Chutz La'aretz, in Bavel. So the Gemara answers, no, really it's not effective. And as the Mefarshim actually speak out, really this Rabba bar Rav Huna had smicha in Bavel as well. That's why he was allowed to judge in Bavel, and actually he had a double smichut in Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. But all Rabba bar Rav Huna was saying was, B'milta da'alma hu de'ukim lei. All he was saying was trying to stop the argument of the Reish Galut. He was saying, you know who I am? I don't need you, because I have authority granted all the way back from Rebbe. But indeed in halacha, actually, that authority would not be able to cover him and cover him with immunity in Bavel. He was just trying to stop up the arguments of the Reish Galut, like, do you know who I am? So the Gemara says, but one second, if really indeed that authority would not be effective, meaning when you don't have authority, when you only have authority from Eretz Yisrael, but not from Bavel, Rabba bar Chana reshuta dinakat lamale. As we're going to see later in the story, that before Rabba bar Chana descended from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he wanted to receive smicha from the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael. So why was he asking for smichut? If it's not going to cover him anyways, it's not going to grant him immunity in Bavel, and he's about to travel to Bavel, what's the purpose of that smichut? Why was he asking Rabba bar Chana from, as we'll see later, from the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael for his coverage? So the Gemara answers, you're right. It wouldn't cover him, wouldn't grant him immunity in Bavel. For that, he would have to ask for smichut from the head of Babylonia, from the Reish Galuta. But there were certain cities that were outside of Bavel, that were on the border of Eretz Yisrael, and those cities were not deemed part of Bavel, they were deemed part of Eretz Yisrael. So if he were to adjudicate a case in those cities, it would grant him immunity because those cities are considered connected to Eretz Yisrael. Beautiful. Okay, so now we've shown that there's this idea of smichut, or authority granted in Eretz Yisrael, which would not cover you for Bavel. And there's also this idea of smichut in Bavel, it does cover you for Eretz Yisrael. And we had this story with Rabba bar Chana, where, as we said, he asked for smicha before going to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara wants to know now, what was that story? And this is really the second section, which will lead us to the discussions tomorrow. Says the Gemara, my rishuta, what was this permission or this authority that Rabba bar Chana was requesting in order to adjudicate cases and have coverage in Bavel? So the Gemara tells us, there was a story when Rabba bar Chana wanted to descend to Bavel. So he wanted to go from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. Amar le Rabbi Chia le Rebbe. So Rabbi Chia went to his Rebbe. He went to Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and Rabbi Chia said to Rebbe, he wanted to obtain smicha for his nephew, which was Rabba bar Chana. It's going to be a bit of a complicated family tree. Bezrat Hashem will get it clear. But Rabbi Chia was the uncle of Rabba bar Chana. So Rabbi Chia went to Rebbe, and he was going to ask permission for smicha for Rabba bar Chana, who was now descending to Bavel. So Rabbi Chia said to Rebbe, Ben achi yored leBavel. My nephew, the son of my brother, my nephew, is descending to Bavel. So he said, Yoreh. He asked Rebbe, he asked Rebbe, Yoreh? Could he adjudicate? Now, Yoreh specifically refers to Isur v'Heter, to prohibitory law. Does he have smicha to adjudicate prohibitory law, things that are permitted and prohibited? So Rebbe said, Yoreh, yes, he does have such authority. I give him my smichut. Yadin. Now, Yadin specifically refers to cases of monetary law. Could he also adjudicate cases of monetary law? So Rabbi said Yadin. He could. Yatir bechorot. Now, this is an interesting scenario. The halacha is a firstborn animal needs to be given to the Kohen, and the halacha is that if it's unblemished, meaning it's tamim, it's without a damage to it, permanent damage, then it's brought as a korban. If it does have a mum, some sort of a blemish, the Kohen can eat it and slaughter it in a local butchery, not a problem. Now this was after the destruction of the temple, and therefore you couldn't bring korbanot anymore. So what they had to do was wait till the animals that were first born developed a mum of some sort, and then it was allowed to be eaten. In the local slaughterhouse. That was the point. But in order to determine that it was allowed to be eaten, you had to first say that it had this mum kavua, this permanent blemish. So one of the positions of authority was a person who could determine that the bechor, the firstborn animal, had this permanent blemish. So Rabbi Chia said to Rabbi, Yatir bechorot, could he permit a bechor by seeing this permanent blemish? So Rabbi said, Yatir, he could. He has my authority for that as well. Now the Gemara says a related story, which is very similar. We'll contrast these tomorrow. But Kihava nachit Rav le Bavel, when Rav wanted to descend from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Amar le Rabbi Chia, again, Rabbi Chia approached the Rebbe. He came to his Rebbe, and we're going to see Rav was also a nephew of Rabbi Chia. So Rabbi Chia approached Rebbe, and Rabbi Chia said to Rebbe, Ben achoti. Now here it says the son of my sister. So it would appear Rav was also a nephew of Rabbi Chia, but he was the son of Rabbi Chia's sister. Ben achoti yored leBavel. The son of my sister is going to descend to Bavel. Yored, could he adjudicate prohibitory law? And Rabbi said, Yored, he could. Yadin, could he adjudicate monetary law? Yadin, he could. Yatir bechorot, could he permit a bechor by showing that there is a permanent blemish on it? He said, Al Yatir. No, that he's not allowed to do. Now, tomorrow we'll see why Rebbe granted authority to Rabba Bar Chana to do this, but not to Rav. We'll see later. But the Gemara first wants to know, in terms of the contrast in story, is that in the stories, Rabbi Chia calls Rabba Bar Chana the son of my brother. He calls Rav the son of my sister. So the Gemara says, Ma'ishna lemar de kakari ben achi. Why is it that Rabbi Chia called Rabba Bar Chana the son of my brother? U'ma'ishna lemar de kakari ben achoti. And what's the difference that he called Rav the son of my sister? So you'll say, that's a klotz kasha. That's not a good question. Maybe you'll say, that was the reality, is that Rabbi Chia had a sister and Rav was her kid. He had a brother and Rabba Bar Chana was his kid. So that's the reality. But the Gemara says that's not true. Because V'ha'amar mar, but we know that it's stated, Evo, 5 people. Evo, V'chana, Chana is a man actually. It's not Chana like a woman. Chana, it's a man. V'shela, Umarta, V'Rabbi Chia, these 5 men, Kulu b'nei Abba bar Acha Karsela mikafri havu. These were all the sons of Abba bar Acha Karsela from Kafri. So these were all sons of of this fellow whose name was Abba bar Acha Karseloi from Kafri. Now, the Gemara doesn't speak this out, but it's important to note. Evo was the father of Rav. Rav was Rav bar Evo. Evo was the father of Rav, which means Rabbi Chia, who was the brother of Evo, was the uncle of Rav. And Chana actually was the father of Rabba. But what we see is both of these men, Rav and Rabba bar Chana, were both nephews as the sons of brothers of Rabbi Chia. So why does he call Rav then the son of my sister? Oh. So the Gemara gives 2 answers for this. Answer number 1. For this, we're going to have to do a little bit of a lineage here. Answer number 1. Rav bar Achva Dahava bar Achte. Rav was indeed the son of the brother of Rabbi Chia, but he was also the son of the sister of Rabbi Chia. How can you have someone who's the son of my brother and the son of my sister? Sounds a little bit incestual, problematic. So the Gemara says, like, the Mefarshim speak out like this. Oh, before we see that, Rabba bar Chana, but Rabba bar Chana was bar Achva Dilav bar Achte. He was the son of the brother of Rabbi Chia, but not the son of the sister. So let me just speak this out how the Mefarshim explain, like this. This fellow, Abba Bar Acha Karsila, was married one time, and his wife passed away. Now, from that first union, he had a son who was Evo. He remarried a woman who already had a daughter, different daughter. Now, Evo and that daughter are what's called step-siblings, but they're not related at all. Okay, from that second union, actually, Rabbi Chia was born. That brother and, so it's Rabbi Chia's half-brother and half-sister, but that half-brother and half-sister are not related. Rav was born of that union. The step-siblings married, but they're not related at all, as I just illustrated, and therefore, actually, Rabbi Chia was correct in saying Rav is the son of my sister, because really it was the son of my sister, son of my brother, which was the union that was created afterwards. But Rabba Bar Chana was only the son of my brother, that's why he referred to them differently. That's answer number one. Alternatively, give a second answer, turn to him with bet, al shem chochmato. You don't have to say this necessarily. Meaning it could be Rav was just, you don't have to necessarily say Rav was the son of his brother, but why does he say the son of my sister? Why is there that emphasis? Because a sister is a reference to chokhmah. It's a reference to wisdom. Rav was a tremendous chacham, and the pasuk in Mishlei teaches us, and more la chokhmah chotiat. Say to wisdom, you are my sister. So as a reference to the greatness of the wisdom of Rav, Rabbi Chia said, the son of my sister, meaning a person who has tremendous wisdom, would you grant him chokhmah? And that's why he referred to him in that way. Now we're going to stop here, the top of Ham with Bet. We're going to continue tomorrow discussing the contrast between these two stories, Zat Hashem with Ham with Bet. But in the meantime, everybody have a wonderful day.